Thanks very much. How can advances in medicine and sports science, data analysis and AI give football teams an edge? In short, can science win the World Cup? That's what we're getting into on today's special episode of The World, the Universe and Us from New Scientist, recorded live at the Royal Society in London. I'm Rowan Hooper, I'm a journalist at New Scientist, and we've got some fantastic guests on today's show, and I'm going to introduce them now. Dr. Charlotte Cowie is Chief Medical Officer at the British Olympic Association, and from 2016 to 2026, she was Chief Medical Officer for the British Football Association. Professor Holly Bridge. Holly is Professor of Neuroscience at the University of Oxford and is part of the Football on the Brain team, exploring the connections between neuroscience and football. And Dr. Ian Graham. Ian was Director of Research at Liverpool FC from 2012 to 2023. He's the author of How to Win the Premier League, and he runs the sports advisory business, Ludonautics. So welcome all of you guys. Now, I wanted to start by asking about the current World Cup, which I'm sure everyone's been watching. Let's start with, is there a team, let's start with you, Charlotte, is there a team you can point to where you've seen an especially interesting use of science or medicine or data that has struck you?
Yeah, thanks. Obviously, I have a little bit of a bias, so I'm going to go with the England team. And actually, their preparation started a long time out from the World Cup. You know, this involves a lot of preparation for sports medicine and sports science teams. This time last year, this is not a trade secret because it has been published in the media, but they got the squad to swallow heat-sensing pills so they could measure in real time their core temperature and put them in heat chambers at different temperatures, different humidities, to test their reaction to heat, how they dealt with it, and to experiment with different ways of managing individually their response to heat as well. So it was a great scientific intervention, but also helped to start the conversation with players about what it might be like this summer and create some anticipation of some of the difficulties we know they will face in this World Cup.
Well, because it was already anticipated to be a hot World Cup,
absolutely,
which we're going to get into. So there were mini thermometers, effectively, that went in. And did that lead to any changes in how, recommendations for what players should do to keep cool?
So I think it's helpful to have an understanding of how individual players respond, because what they were also recording was their reported fatigue levels, and it's amazing how different players perceive heat and the level of fatigue relative to their actual fatigue when you measure their heart rate and other physiological responses. So I think it helped A, to understand individual responses, B, for players to understand what their responses were and try and mitigate those in advance. But also, as I say, it created just that expectation of a month spent, or hopefully more, spent in that extreme heat, and how they needed to start, acclimatising even before they got out there in terms of their own exposure to heat and starting to get comfortable with it.
Okay. Holly, we've already seen some big teams go out on penalties already. Very sadly, Germany's gone out, and the Netherlands, very sadly. What about this dreaded penalty shootout? Is there, can you give us some insight into that? What's going on there when a players face that situation?
So obviously I don't work with players directly. I'm very much a sort of brain person. But if you think about what's going through a player's brain while they're standing there deciding what to do. So theoretically they should have made up their mind what they're going to do at a point when they're practicing. But clearly no one goes to take a penalty that's not going to be in a corner and that's going to be at an easy level to save. So if you think about when people are making a decision, they're going to be using information, their sort of prior knowledge, which is going to be sort of incorporated along with their current sensory information. Now, I think, so obviously last night, that goalkeeper was very tall. So, in terms of reach and where can he actually save the ball, it's greater than for other people who are smaller. So, Germany previously are known for being very sort of psychologically strong, and irrespective of what's going on, they're going to win their penalty shootout. So this was a complete turn of events where actually that didn't happen this time. So I think it's the first time they've not won a penalty shootout. I mean, in terms, so the other thing, so you've got your prior experience of taking penalties, but you've also got your sort of recent experience of what's gone on the pitch. Now, the sort of expectation that you're going to beat a team gives you a sort of expectation that you're going to play well, you're going to be able to pass the ball around, and because potentially because what they've done didn't live up to those levels, it makes it much more difficult then to sort of take your penalty in a very sort of grounded way.
So you need to kind of reset if you can before. What about when the goalies, like what was that goalie who said, put it in the corner there and really mess with the player's mind? That was really cunning, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that you really, really have to do is make sure that you can block out all the sort of noise, and that takes a lot of practice. So you can train your brain to do that, but it takes practice. And if you are, so for example, if you are already in a stress situation, blocking those things out is much more difficult. So given that they had already underperformed, I think blocking out the stress is much more difficult.
Yeah. Ian, so you pioneered the use of data in the Premier League. What about, we'll get on to that in a bit more perhaps, but are there any teams in the World Cup that you've seen or that you know of are making particularly clever use of data? Or are they all doing it now?
I would say very few are doing it.
Really?
I think it probably takes longer to permeate the national game than it does the club game.
Yeah.
I'll stick on the penalties subject. I'm Welsh, so it's very difficult for me to praise England, but through gritted teeth, I'll say England were the first team to take penalties seriously. I think it was Glenn Hoddle said penalties are a lottery. Well, of course, they're not a lottery. The psychological and physiological aspects are super important, but there's also a whole lot of statistics and data that you can bring to bear on it. So one example would be, if we know that Messi always shoots to the left, it's very easy to save his penalty because you know which way he's going to shoot. But Messi knows that you know that he always shoots to the left, so you should shoot to the... He should think he should shoot to the right, but you know that he knows that you know that. This is game theory, and so statistics, what players have done in the past with their penalty shootouts, plus game theory, knowing that I know what you've done in the past and you know that I know what you've done in the past, that can inform you where best to place your penalty in the future. And the best strategy tends to be a mixed strategy. So you want to randomize where you're going to put the ball. It gets a little bit more complicated because you can have different strategies. So some of the best players will make a little stutter in their run-up to get a trigger action from the goalkeeper and just pass the ball into the opposite corner. So that's called a keeper-dependent strategy. The best goalkeepers will fake a trigger to try and goad the player into shooting in that direction. So a good friend of mine, Ignacio Palacios Huerta, works with the England team since 2018 to go through this game theory approach to say, against this goalkeeper and in this situation, you should kick this way unless the goalkeeper does this, in which you kick this way. From a lottery, you don't get to 100% we're going to win the penalty shootout, but if you can get to 70%, I'd take that over 50-50 any day.
Yeah. Well, sometimes you see the goalies they look at their water bottles, don't they?
Yeah, and that all comes from deep stats research, and just the data of he shot there and the keeper dived there. The data's not granular enough. You want to see if there's a stutter in the run-up and if there's a trigger move from the goalkeeper as well.
To Holly's point as well, though, to Holly's point as well, if you have done that homework, then you feel more confident in that situation as well, so you're more likely to be able to get over those nerves and focus.
One factoid on this sort of randomising your strategy. Messi, Maradona, Ribéry, Cantona have all said, when I run up to take the penalty kick, I don't know which direction I'm going to kick the ball in. I think you really need to be a top player to do that, but that kind of says something about their psychology, but also how they've optimised their strategies.
So they can make a really split-second decision, probably subconsciously, as to what the goalie's doing, and then they decide where they put it. Wow. I thought I'd ask each of you to give an example from your work individually that is something that's made a difference, perhaps over the course of your career. Something that's really changed from, basically when we were kids, not, watching football back in the day. what's something that's really changed, Charlotte? Do you want to start off?
Again, obviously, I've got an England team's bias here, but I think the thing that I would say has made a massive difference from a sports medicine science point of view is I think everybody's thinking there'll be some specific cutting edge technology or something like that, but in actual fact, the most important things in terms of creating a really successful player are not the 1%ers, they're the 99%ers. It's the things like good nutrition, good sleep, good recovery, good injury prevention, great strength and conditioning to build athleticism. And you can't decide to have a good diet or do a strength and conditioning program the night before a World Cup final. You have to do that every day, every week for years and years. And so the dual combination of St George's Park National Football Centre, which is now somewhere where potential England players come from the age of 14 and start to learn what it's like to become an England player, how it's like to compete in an under-17s World Cup and under-19s and under-21s and start to engage with our sports medicine and sports science from an early age, and then to parallel that in club football, the elite professional player programme, EPPP, which is a mandated programme where academies have to provide education, mental health support, strength and conditioning, means that the group of players that we have now for England that are coming through are not just talented, but they are so athletic, they're so tuned in, they are educated. You can have a conversation with them about their nutritional strategy, about their recovery strategy, and that's produced this almost embarrassment of incredible, articulate players, such that, we're in a situation where Cole Palmer and Phil Foden are not in an England squad, which I think is just massive tribute to those steady inching away medical and sports science and academic achievements of those players.
Should Cole Palmer be in the squad?
What about Trent?
Trent, he's even more of a sin to admit Trent.
We're not going to draw you on that.
Well, no.
It was a very, very unfair question. I apologise.
No, well, but as we were saying earlier, some countries the team chooses itself because there's not sufficient depth to get down to the 55 players who could all be part of the 23-man squad. So I think that just speaks to that real wealth of development of players to the highest level.
I wonder what the pundits make of it, because they came through at a time where you'd go out drinking and smoking after, or maybe before a match in some cases.
Indeed, yeah.
And now they're seeing something completely different. It's it must fry their minds in some ways.
I think that's where some of the coaches who are currently successful and will be more successful are those coaches who can speak to players, the new players, not the old players, and that is a slightly different mindset. Jim Hicks is in the audience, and I know him from Millwall Football Club, which is my first ever football club. And yes, certainly before the match as well as after the match was not the nutritional or lifestyle choices that we probably choose nowadays. So yeah, I've seen that.
Put. Holly, what about from your background point of view?
So I think actually I would probably look forward because, over the past sort of 2 years, or maybe 2 to 3 years, actually what's happened is people have started to ask us about, what is the role of neuroscience in football? So sort of moving away from the psychology, but saying, what are the things that are going on in people's brains that allow them to be a professional or a successful footballer? And I think people don't quite appreciate what an impact the brain has, and that, Charlotte was talking about education, and that's really important because obviously you're using your brain for education, but you're actually using it when you're playing football. People talk about, you're using 10 to 20% of your brain, which is completely not true, because you're using a massive proportion of it if you're playing football, because you're using all your senses. You need to see what's going on. You've got visual spatial awareness. Where is everybody else? You have to listen for things. You have to talk. All of these actions are required for football, and you need your brain to be working well. And I think people are really interested in what can you do to sort of boost decision making, what can you do to boost creativity, and all of these are ways in which your brain can learn. Your brain can learn these things. So looking to optimize how you coach people, both sort of on the pitch but also in the classroom, is going to be really important. So I'm looking forward.
But so when when people talk of like, oh, he's got a good footballing brain, is that what they mean? Like for someone like Alonso at Liverpool, or say, who, you know, you can see what's happening in the match and pick people out, and sort of, is that what they mean? Like all these different senses and inputs are being integrated very rapidly and from a high level?
So, I mean, when you're talking about a football brain, I mean, you've got to integrate what's going on at that point. So you're taking in sensory information, but you're also integrating with your past experience. So in order to make a decision, you have to know what happened last time. If it went wrong, you need to learn from that mistake. So those people who've got a good football brain have probably made quite good predictions initially, then they've corrected them. And that cycle of making a mistake, correcting it to improve, may well just work faster in them. But I guess the argument would be that everyone can learn, because brains are wired to learn, whether it's football or whether it's education.
Ian, what about the use of data?
Data is a really easy answer, because 20 years ago when I started my career, data about football just didn't exist. So the data revolution in football is seen as a new thing, and it is a new thing, but it's because the raw material, the data, is now available. So if you look at baseball or cricket, for hundreds of years, ball by ball, you could see who the bowler was, who the batter was, what the outcome of the shot was, and the outcome of that shot, a six or a wicket, means something for the game. Football data until 20 years ago was the full-time score, the attendance, and the name of the referee. You would know if a player was sent off. You might know the team sheets, like who played as well. It's very, very little data to go on. Then maybe 15 years ago, touch-by-touch data, you knew where the ball was, who was doing what with the ball. So that went from like 1 row of information per game to about 2,000 rows of information. And now using optical technology, so there's cameras in every Premier League stadium, every World Cup stadium, 25 frames per second for 22 players plus the ball, plus the referee. Although the Premier League scrubbed out the position of the referee when I worked for a Premier League club, so we couldn't complain about the referee not being able to see the action. You can see, there's literally nowhere for the players to hide. So even when you've got some information that I passed the ball backwards, that's not a very good thing to do. Now we can see exactly the array of options that a player had. Maybe passing backwards was the best I could have done in that situation, or maybe I turned down a great pass to you in the box. So the amount of information we can wring out of the data available today is huge. 20 years ago, I was building very simple Poisson goal scoring rates for teams, because that's literally all of the data that we had. And to try and say something, this player played for this team while they were scoring a lot of goals, it doesn't really say if they're a very good player or not.
But so when you have all these massive amounts of data now, is it a human going through it and saying, it looks like you shouldn't have done this part, or can you get an AI to do this for you?
So AI is a good technique. We try to build models based on physics and on reasoning first of all, so that we've got a chance to understand why the model's making the suggestions it does. So, for example, when we've got the information about where all of the players on the pitch are, there's a concept called pitch control, which is who controls what part of the pitch. That's based on where you are on the pitch, but also which direction you're running in. If I'm already in motion, I control a bit more of the pitch ahead of me and a bit less behind me. A bit less behind because I have to decelerate and turn around if I want to go back in that direction. So you can basically see who's in charge of which parts of the pitch. You can put a basic physics model, a physics passing model, to say, I can hit the ball with this accuracy at this velocity, and predict whether that pass with that trajectory will get intercepted or not. That gives you an idea of passing lanes and what the chance of a pass being completed is. And really, a player's abilities are, can they execute a pass better than the average player? So Steven Gerrard's one of my favourite players. His speciality was 40 yards diagonal passes that our model would say, your typical player's not going to make that pass. So we could say it's a bad decision because we think the pass has got a low chance of success. But if you've got the skill of Steven Gerrard, for him, it's a good decision. So we can find, and it's only today that we can start to say something about the decision-making behaviour of players. We just couldn't see what they were doing before.
I want to talk about youth versus experience. One of the stars of this World Cup already is Lamine Yamal of Spain. He's only 18. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we've got Messi, 39, Ronaldo's 41. Can we talk about the relative benefits of raw youth and a wise old head? I don't know who wants to take that first.
I mean, I can start in terms of, so as I've already alluded to, the brain is essentially built on experience. So the more you do something, the more you experience situations, essentially the more efficiently your brain will work. So if you are older and have been playing football for many more years, the likelihood is that you will have experienced the situations more often. Your brain will be wired to respond quickly. So I mean, you see this in youth football all the time. If the ball's up in the air and the little kid tries to head it, they're nowhere near it. But you don't see that in adult football so much, and you certainly don't see it in the professional game. And that's because the brain becomes very, very good at predicting what's going to happen. It's very good at anticipation. So in those older players, you might argue that actually what they've done is they've sort of moved from that sort of the being the prime physical sort of specimen to actually building their brains so they can make up for that time where they might be a bit slower.
But what about, isn't there something to be said for the lack of fear that you have as a kid, as an 18-year-old? You see them attempt things perhaps that, your older player wouldn't bother.
I mean, that's like driving a car recklessly, right? So that we know that the adolescent brain is wired to take more risks. So there's a sort of balance between your risk-taking areas, which give you great reward if you're successful, and your prefrontal cortex, which is sort of the voice of reason, which says, I'm never going to make that pass, or I'm 99% certain that I'm not going to make that pass. So there is this idea that if you, as an adolescent, you can take more risks, and the brain, that prefrontal cortex, is not fully mature until about 25. So a lot of footballers are within that age range where they will be tempted to take risks. Maybe that's what makes football more fun to watch.
That's really interesting. One of the things you see in winger is the position where young players get a lot of opportunity because a lot of explosive speed is needed. The number of dribbles and one-on-one attempts that players make, that's the first thing to really drop off. And you kind of wonder, is that because they've got a little less physical capacity, or is it because they now have got a better judgment of whether it's the right thing to do or not? So that 25 years old certainly rang a bell with me. When you look at a wide range of players statistically, on average, players will peak at about 27. So that's the sweet spot between you're still in your physical prime, but you've built up that level of experience that you know the right thing to do in every moment. It's quite interesting the way that varies across position. Goalkeeper, doesn't matter if you're 35 or 40 even, you can still be a really, really good goalkeeper. Winger peaks earliest because it requires that explosive pace. A lot of wingers kind of change their role and position slightly. And then, interestingly, like defensive midfielder and centre-back, where those positions, it's a lot of off-ball positioning and judgment rather than your skill on the ball. They peak a lot older. Centre midfielder is one where seeing the picture of the game and knowing the right thing to do in this situation is as important or more important than your physical capacity or your technical skill. With Messi in particular, Messi was the best player in the world age 21 and just stayed there. And so Yamal, if he stays as professional as Messi did, could go the similar way. So see a similar sort of thing with Ronaldo or Modric. But you have to bear in mind that those players are very much the exception. They're so skillful that Messi's also allowed his teammates to do a lot of his work for him, which allows him to look as good. If he had to do the same physical effort as he had to do age 25, I'm not sure he would look as good. But he's so skillful that it's the right thing for his teammates to do his running for him.
I think the other thing I would say, it's a team sport, right? So obviously you ideally want that combination of some people who will run and are really enthusiastic and haven't experienced the bitter failure that some of the older players have. But you need, Jordan Henderson is there, for a number of reasons, but it's not that he is absolutely the most able player in the squad, but he's experienced a series of major tournaments. It's been a really important influence to younger players, including Jude Bellingham. So I think that mix of youth and experience is probably your ideal combination.
Yeah, okay, so you've mentioned Bellingham, and I wanted to ask in particular about him, but there was a moment in the game England against Panama when, just me watching from my armchair, we hadn't been playing very well, and it seemed like suddenly Bellingham just said, I've had enough of this, I'm just going to go and win this game now, and seemed to turn it on. And even though he's surrounded by other pro footballers, he seemed somehow different. And what was going on there? Ian, do you want to talk about that?
I'm going to pour cold data water over this post hoc narrative fallacy you've just explained.
Go for it, yeah.
So narrative fallacy and post hoc fallacy, which is we won the game, therefore we must have been better, therefore it was Bellingham deciding to do this. It's a disease of football, and one that's very hard to fight against because our storytelling brains are hardwired to love that sort of story and causal explanation. So think like taking a scientific or a data approach, you have to have a hypothesis. So what I would just want to do is go back in time with you to before the game and say, well, what do you think Bellingham is going to do in this game? Would you have made that prediction? And you can ask, if he was able to do that in the 80th minute, why didn't he do it in the 20th minute? He's a really good
Save
player.
us all the bother of...
Yeah. That being said, Panama's not a great team. They were very well organised, but with some fatigue, they're probably less fit than England. I don't know if that's true or not. They probably are. And they probably have worse quality substitutes than England. So towards the end of the game, favourites tend to score more heavily. From a statistical point of view, the problem with football and the beauty of football is there are 100 explanations and 10 of the factors probably have some effect. So we can all argue about, which effect is the most important. I'll always go for the boring statistical answer.
No, that's why you're here. We want that, Nick.
So a sort of alternative explanation would be the fact that in terms of, so you could ask anyone, what motivates you? And the problem is if you've got a team that's almost expected to win and you've got a team that are perceived to be weaker, the team that are strong sort of expect to score. So our brains are wired to sort of reward us when we get a sort of unexpected surprise or unexpected good things happen. So what that does is your expectation of reward will motivate you more or less. So because scoring against Panama to an England player would essentially be much less rewarding than Panama scoring against England, that sets things up differently in the sort of minds of the players. So there's dopamine has a lot to play in that as well.
Is that about similarly when you have a minnow playing a big team and no one? Well, often the minnows will just park the bus or park two buses in front of the goal, and it's hard to do anything. They won't let you play, or that's what people say.
The level of motivation is going to be high, and what constitutes a reward if you're playing against England? It may well be the fact that you've tackled Jude Bellingham. That the rewards that you get are not necessarily scoring a goal; they can be anything that sort of gives you success.
Yes, a spirited loss is kind of a success for Panama. We went toe to toe with one of the favourites.
Yeah. Okay. I want to talk about the role of the manager. And particularly in a World Cup, because we're used to managers really imprinting their style onto the team, and we have to mention Jurgen Klopp because obviously you work very closely with him, and then you get this sort of heavy metal football style, or you can have someone like Gareth Southgate who is more defensive minded and perhaps a bit more cautious. But what I was thinking of with all your use of data is when you get an AI, like in AlphaGo, right? DeepMind's AlphaGo, this was trained. It was trained to play Go over and again, millions and millions of times, but it didn't have any baggage from the human knowledge of thousands of years of playing Go. It just learnt it itself, and it became better than any human. And it makes me wonder, like, sometimes, well, should we really just follow the data and not have this baggage that we might bring to us from being a defender when we were a football player or something?
No, you shouldn't just follow the data is the short answer. It's a game played by people, and okay, AIs can help with psychology and mood and cohesiveness and so on, but the manager has got access to a lot of privileged information about if the player's going through a difficult time. There's a lot of data if they're in a physically good condition. The data about how mentally a good condition they're in is much harder to access. At Liverpool, because Demis from DeepMind is a Liverpool fan, we had a cooperation with them we started off saying we're going to make the AI coach, then we thought Jurgen would get a bit upset about that, so we said the AI assistant coach is just going to help him, right? But it's a super hard thing to do the more human side of the job. So from a tactics and a selection on player skill level and on how those players cooperate with each other, yes, data can take you a long way, but there's still a sort of, I wish it was all data, but there's still a human element.
Yeah, but what about, for example, I'm just speaking as an absolute armchair, fan, watching the Japan game, right? Japan-Brazil. You think, right, they've got a chance here. While you're 1-0 up, keep going, get another one. But they didn't. And we've seen this with England as well, just sat on a 1-0. And it's not going to, you might get away with it, but you might not. And Japan didn't. And you just think, don't be so defensive. And surely...
Yeah, so, I mean, in football in general, the impact of a coach is overrated. I will make
told that to Jurgen.
I will make an exception of Jurgen. So the sort of rule of thumb is getting a really good coach versus a really bad coach is similar level of impact in terms of your points this season of getting one extra good player versus one extra bad player. Longer term, it's more of a problem because if you've got a bad coach, the results continue to be a bit subpar. The players don't respect the coach. The coach maybe want to transfer in some bad players as well. So Jurgen's kind of like the Messi of coaches, so we give him a free pass on this one. That being said, it's because what coaches bring is really difficult to measure in data. So they bring the kind of emotional philosophy of the team, can't measure that very easily. They bring the tactics, which you can measure, but that's kind of like it's up to the coach, and it's a negotiation between the owners of the team and the coach, what style do you want to play. Picking the best players, that's something you can measure in data. And I think one of the things with England was you had the best attacking talent for a generation or for more generations. It was world-class attacking talent for the first time in many, many years at England. The defenders weren't as world-class as they have been in the past. I don't know Gareth Southgate at all. I would guess he's quite a conservative person. His response to not having the best defenders and having a great set of attackers was to put more defenders on the pitch and to play in a more defensive style, which kind of minimised England's chance of success, in my opinion. But again, from the outside, not knowing what his plan was, this is just my opinion of what my guess to his plan. You have to be on the inside to really know how much of a difference they made. So what was the real answer?
Well, I guess the only thing I would say is, what we were talking about earlier on is, you're sort of characterising that in a narrative of he wasn't very successful, when in actual fact he was really successful. So I guess, there's lots of ways in which what he did has worked extremely well and got the squad to the point where we expect them to reach the final stages of a tournament, which was not the case when he first started with them. So I guess it depends, isn't it? I do think that the non-AI bit of coaching is probably something that he's really good at, and Jurgen as well, which is around what in the old days people would have called man management, but I guess involves a lot around culture, is a lot around the interaction between different players and the way you conduct yourself and where you sort of get over some of the inevitable hurdles that will happen over the course of a major tournament, with lots of people who don't know each other very well, living together in very close quarters, not able to see their family, not able to escape, and coming under increasing intensity of physical and psychological pressure. So I think, those are the bits that's much harder to measure. And also, if you take sort of average data, even from average sort of, say, professional player data, these players are such outliers that I think it's really hard to sort of average anything in elite sport, because there are still relatively few data points in terms of what makes a truly great player or a truly great team. So I guess that's my sort of caveat of the AI and data world.
This is a very hot World Cup, as we already mentioned earlier, and we've got these ad breaks or hydration breaks in between. What do we know about that from a science point of view? I mean, people are upset that it's breaking up the flow of the game, but what do we think of it scientifically, and is it good to have these little mini breaks to take on some more fluids?
I mean, I would say if it's hot, yes. But obviously, some of these hydration breaks have been taken when it's not even really that hot. So I guess there's some controversy about what the hydration break means in terms of flow, in terms of coaching, and what advantages that might bring. But effectively, once the wet bulb globe temperature, or temperature plus humidity, reaches a certain point, it is extremely fatiguing, and it is fair to players to have some kind of a break or opportunity to cool down if it starts to get to a point where it might be dangerous to their health, and also detrimental to their performance. So in theory, yes, a good idea, but we all saw it was raining and they still had a hydration break. So
I mean, in terms of heat, if you look at sort of brain function, because the blood gets drawn to the extremities, you get an increased sort of cardiac output, but a lot of that actually, instead of going to the brain, goes to the rest of the head, so you can cool down. So the brain, when it's hot, gets about 20% less oxygen, and the sort of upshot of that is that actually it just doesn't function as well. They've looked at people's brains with brain scanners, so they've got people to either go into a hot bath and then go in the brain scanner, or they've got them to exercise till they getting up to about 41 degrees in both cases. And if you look in the brain scanner, actually being passively heated, i.e. by the weather, is worse than getting hot through exercise. And you see a sort of decrease in cognitive performance. People aren't as good at doing tasks, and you also see a decrease in the activity. Now, with regard to the hydration break, in that study, before they got them to heat up, they gave them either water at 25 degrees or they gave them ice chips. And where they gave them ice chips, you actually counteracted all the detrimental effects on the brain. So whether it lasts 22, 23, 24 minutes is a different matter, but certainly in the short term, you can decrease that reduction in brain function.
Players wear strapping if they've got a sore muscle. Could you not wear some sort of cooling cap and cool the brain down? I mean, it's not doping. But it's a use of something externally to, you just said it, 20% of the blood flow you've lost out on the brain.
I mean, so cooling it would prevent the blood going to the sort of the scalp instead. I don't know, I can't imagine it being adopted. Look at Charlotte for that.
Now I'm making this up as well. So it's hard, isn't it? Because you use a lot of heat through your head. So if you've got a hat on as well, I don't know how you would have a mechanism by which the cold water was exchanged when it got warm for more cold water after 5 minutes. Or it's worth exploring as an idea.
I think we should
Maybe in the
fly
next
you out
World
to
Cup.
the USA and pitch it to Tuchel.
Yeah, someone in Silicon Valley will take this idea and try it out.
From a stats perspective, the amount of distance and sprinting distance players have been able to do has increased a lot over the last 20 years. And so heat is probably going to make players less able to cover that amount of high intensity distance. So we might see a slower set of games in the hot temperatures. I think not much work's been done on heat, but a lot of work has been done on height. Altitude is a big physiological difference. Bolivia are not a very good football team, but they win a huge amount of their home games because it's at like 5,000 or 3,000 meters altitude. So the away teams do really badly, and Bolivia do really badly when they're away. And we've seen a similar thing with Bodo Glimt in the Champions League. Away teams play badly in Arctic temperatures on a plastic pitch. And so teams a bit more used to the heat might have an extra home advantage in the same way that Bolivia and Bodo Glimt do.
So just on a completely different note, so heat also tends to increase sort of aggression. So I was going to turn to Ian and say, are there more cards when it's in a hot place?
You know what? I've got a database that's got the answer just waiting for us to have a look at.
So when the summers of violence, when people go out and like people riot in the summer, right? And the hotter it is, the more likely they are to do it. Wow. So heat has many sort of bad effects.
There we go. We'll write a paper on that.
Right.
Well, I mean, look, it's not. We should say it's not a randomly hot World Cup. It's hot because of the climate crisis, which is also, by the way, not great that we've got Aramco as one of the major sponsors of this World Cup. But the next one in 2030, it's in Spain, Portugal, and Morocco. It's going to be even hotter. Got another 4 years. We're breaking temperature records every day. Last week we were, and certainly every year. Are we going to have winter tournaments? Do you think?
FIFA, they've already done it, right?
Well, they did. They had to do it in there, but is it going to be something that's more common? I mean, players' health is going to be at risk, isn't it?
That's where everybody's got to go in terms of solutions, isn't it? I guess in terms of teams playing in countries other than the UK, even teams who are playing in the Premier League who go to Champions League fixtures, or national teams who go and play in Europe now sometimes expect, if they play in the summer, that they will get heats of the type that they've been encountering in the US, Mexico and Canada. And the Women's World Cup is in Brazil next year. So this is something that will carry on being an issue. I guess the ironic thing that we saw in Qatar initially and increasingly now is air-conditioned stadia, which obviously use more energy and are even worse for the climate, but keep the players cool while they're playing. So whether that's the solution, whether it's evening games the solution, or whether it's a different time of year, I guess that will be for FIFA to work out in the next 4 years or so.
And you mentioned the Women's World Cup, and I know you've worked a lot on the women's game as well. Can you tell us a bit about what the gap in our sort of understanding and the input that there's been in the men's game to the women's? Because am I right that women get more ACL injuries than men?
Yes, they do.
Why is that?
Yeah. So we don't know. It's multifactorial, I guess. Women do get about twice as many ACL injuries as men, and that's a lot about anatomy and physiology. The notch through which the ACL travels is a bit smaller. The ACL is a little bit thinner in women. The biomechanics of their leg, where they tend to have a wider hip and a narrower knee, also make a bit of a difference to what we call valgus strain through the knee. So there are those elements, and sort of multiple elements, I suppose. It's not necessarily so. For instance, groin injuries are more common in men than women, and I think with that focus on this is worse in women, and a lot of talk about, is this worse because women menstruate, and I get that, those things are important to look at, but it is also important to understand that some of the major causes of injuries are things like poor pitches, equipment is made for men and not for women, insufficient strength and conditioning programs for women in the professional game. So I think it's really important to look at the modifiable risk factors for ACL injury, because women can't stop being women. And so I think that's the focus, I would say, is important for women's football. I'm
going to get audience questions in a minute, but another thing that struck me recently, I think it was just after the Germany-Paraguay game, was I heard some pundits saying Paraguay wanted it more. And you'd often hear that phrase, so they wanted it more. What do we understand by that scientifically? I don't know who wants to take that one first.
That probably comes to me, doesn't it? But I'm not. I'm not sure if there's. I'm not sure if there's a good answer, because I would argue that Germany did not want to get knocked out of the World Cup. You know, they didn't. They clearly didn't set out to lose the match or to not score goals. You know, they made a lot of chances. So you know, the sort of this idea that you kind of give intention to someone based on their behaviour, and I think that's a big assumption to sort of make conclusions about what people are thinking based on their behaviour, because there's a lot of things that will be going on. And I think probably Charlotte's got more insight into that, having dealt with players. But yeah, judging people's intentions from their behaviour from a neuroscience point of view is not really valid.
I mean, we talked about this a little bit earlier. I think it is really difficult when players sort of shut down or don't seem to be performing in the way that they should do. I think if you're in a skill-based team sport, anybody, you know, in the room who's played football or tennis or any skill-based sport, darts even, and you think you're playing well, and then things start to not go so well, and you start to think, oh, actually, maybe I'm not as good as I thought. Maybe things aren't going for me today. You know, maybe somebody makes a comment, like, you know, several million people make a comment and go, oh, they're rubbish, and you start to feel anger or frustration or shame or embarrassment or fear, then suddenly that affects the way that you can express yourself on the pitch. It affects the way that you're able to communicate with other players, because you know, we all have a herd mentality, where we fear rejection, we fear that our teammates will also think that we're rubbish. Suddenly those fears set in, and it becomes harder to communicate with teammates. Performance starts to deteriorate further, and so it's really hard to know exactly what's going on psychologically in an individual player or a whole team when things start to go in that way, where it looks as though they're not expressing themselves, they're not trying, and they're not being adventurous. But to understand what's going on in their mind when that happens, I think actually is a journey that probably has gone on within England teams in terms of trying to explore that a little bit more and move away from that sort of that fear that I think it is hard to understand, that really competent, really good players would still feel self-doubt and fear. But of course, you know, they're human, and of course they're being pitted against the other best players in the world, and they sense it in the same way that we would, you know, at a lower level of challenge.
I think that, like, they wanted it more as just a stock phrase that pundits say, and I go back to that, like, narrative fallacy. I think pre-game, we were predicting something like 83% Germany qualify, 17% Paraguay. You know, I'm not sure. It was about that sort of 15 to 20% for Paraguay. So it's kind of like, you know, if you roll a dice, it's 17%, you get a 6. I just wanted it. I rolled a 6. I just wanted it more. Yeah. Versus the 5 times I didn't roll a 6. Then there's something psychologically wrong with me. Football is inherently a high variance game. The outcome of one match doesn't tell you that much about the quality of the team. So, you know, England have been frustrating to watch, but they've got enough points to win the group and got a easy-ish next game. We didn't change our opinion of England that much based on them being slightly disappointing to watch, because, you know, sometimes you win a game, sometimes you lose a game. At Liverpool, we've lost and drawn so many times against Burnley in an exact replay of that Germany and Paraguay game, and the pundits have said Burnley just wanted it more every time. I can guarantee that Burnley did not want it more. It's just something that pundits say.
I've completely forgotten what I was about to say there. Let's move on to some audience questions. Okay, the gentleman over in the blue put his hand up first.
Yes, I apologise. I came in tardily late because I got stuck on the Piccadilly line. It's got an incident going on. I came in when you were talking about hydration. I, as a travel journalist, amongst other things, I've always been aware in hot countries They drink hot liquids to even up the inside temperature to the outside temperature, and you don't sweat. Why don't they give on the hydration breaks, give them hot drinks?
Okay, that's
Give them tea.
I don't know what to say about
especially
this.
the English team.
It is. I can't remember. I was speaking to the other day to somebody about the fact that lots of people in hot countries drink hot drinks. Yeah,
But then they don't run around for 45 minutes.
But then,
after.
the science that we have, as Holly's already mentioned, does suggest that if you want to cool your core temperature down, you should be drinking ice chips or ice slurry. And so I guess we're trying to go with the evidence, and I don't know what the evidence is that suggests, that the hot drinks would make you cooler.
If you even up the inside temperature to the outside temperature, then you won't sweat.
But sweating
But you
is
want
not
to
a bad
sweat.
thing. I mean,
That's what I've been
it might
told
be
by
in some
medical people.
circumstances, but not on a football pitch.
Okay.
So here's an interesting theory. Maybe if you are trying to conserve water rather than actually sweat to cool down, it helps not to sweat. But for players who are exercising and want to cool down, then it is beneficial for them to sweat and rehydrate and take more water on. But I guess if you're in a country where water is scarce, maybe it would be more advantageous just not to sweat at all than it would be to sweat and cool down. There you are.
I guarantee you would get
Just a
mutiny
theory.
if you tried to give them a hot drink when they're already really hot. Like the 1980s.
I think we should send you out and pitch this idea to Tuchel.
We're all out there. Okay, there's a question here. Go ahead.
Two questions, if I can. Ian, you mentioned that not many countries are using data. So which ones are the few, and how would you rate their use of data? And then secondly, could you elaborate on the AI assistant manager at Liverpool?
It's always difficult to know from the outside, right? So England kept what they were doing secret for many years, and it's only because it's become public that I'm able to say, well, I can point to England doing that. The penalty analysis, the first national team I know of doing it was the Netherlands, an even worse penalty taking team than England, in the run up to the was it 2010 they lost the final against Spain? So I think that's the first time that they took penalty data analysis seriously. The reason I think it's less developed in national teams versus clubs is just based on my experience of what I knew the home nations were doing versus what I knew Premier League clubs were doing. It might be different in other countries. It might be a little bit unfair for me to say they're behind. It's just based on the UK experience. And then with the assistant coach, the big concept was let's get an assistant coach to make all the decisions. But really we had to think about what decisions we want this assistant coach to be making. So the two practical things that we did, the first one was using this tracking data to where you see the trajectories for all of the players. We've used kind of traditional statistical models to say, let's stop the video here. Where do we think the ball's going to go next? What do we think a good pass and a bad pass would be? Instead of doing that, hand that problem to AI, which can do a much more complicated job. So the task of the AI was not to stop the video and say, where's the next pass going to go to? It was to stop the video and then say, show me the next 30 seconds of the game, and continue to give me simulations of the next 30 seconds of the game so I could see the whole future history of the things that players might do. And that's the first step to getting AI to tell you something about football tactics, which is what DeepMind had such success with board games. Football is kind of infinite dimensional compared to chess, and also the big determining factor of football is the skills of the players. That the skills of the players decides whether you're going to win or lose the game. It's kind of like having a knight that can move twice having a knight that can move twice without the opposition being able to move. So it's fundamentally just orders of magnitude more difficult than board games. But that was a great first concept. Then the second concept was trying to optimize set pieces, because it's a much smaller decision space, we know what's going to happen. A corner's going to come in, and we know that within 5 seconds the defence is going to clear it, or we're going to make a first contact and create a chance from it. So trying to optimise some set-piece routines was the second little inroad we made into having AI help coaches.
And there's a question at the back there.
Yeah, so this question is mainly for Charlotte. You talked at the start of the talk about the long journey for England preparing for the World Cup and the heat sensing pills that they used. I also wanted to know about how much of that data went into the actual selection process. So we mentioned, Cole Palmer being left at home, Phil Foden being left at home. How much of that decision making was based on the actual data they got from the players in that preparation period?
Yeah, really good question, and not at all. So that I think that's one of the things that coaches' decisions are data informed, but they aren't data driven. And the real point of that exercise, it's great because it's very sciencey, but actually, a lot of it was just about awareness, self-awareness for players, and just trying to anticipate problems. But no, it wasn't involved in the selection as such.
Thanks. So this is a question more on, not so in depth on the penalty shootout, but more on the substitutions. You got the players on the bench, they're watching the game, they're probably hot. What is the psychology about them being subbed in? Is there data being followed that they need to be subbed in or out? Is that something that can impact the opposite team as well? Just wondering if there's any color that you can add to that, really.
I expected someone else to come in, but yes, I'm happy to talk about it. I don't know about the national teams in the World Cup in particular, but I'd say from the Premier League point of view, going from 3 to 5 substitutions is a big difference because you can make a lot more change to the game. And the Premier League has been particularly conservative. It's been surprising to me because they're the most data-informed league. They've been very conservative with using all 5 substitutes. Coaches are generally risk-averse people because their jobs are highly variable. A lot of coaches get sacked for no good reason other than a few results unluckily went against them. So I understand their risk aversion. The rule with coaches as a rule tends to not use enough substitutions, not substitute early enough. So if you go behind, put on an attacker at the 50th minute, not the 70th minute. And the other thing they do is to make defensive substitutions when they're leading and dominating a game. Even Jurgen did this a few times. The most data-driven club in the Premier League, Brentford, banned the coach from making defensive substitutions, and it was the right thing to do.
Wow. So that was the coach being overruled by the data. So that's kind of where I was trying to go to with the idea of an AI manager. Obviously, we cannot go all that way, but being really, really strictly controlled by it. Sorry, go on.
Well, I was going to say that the question was actually about what's that substitute thinking as opposed to what the coach is thinking. So I guess that will vary. That will vary by the player. So like Musiala last night was probably couldn't wait to get on because I guess that's where an area where very short-term data had been used to not start him based on 2 prior performances. And actually you could almost see he came on really sort of wound up. So that gives you an idea about what might be going on in the head while you're on the bench dying to come on. Now, my understanding, I'm not an expert, is that there are now substitution coaches who will be looking to sort of inform these finishing players as opposed to the starting players. So that whole thing is actually being looked at so that rather than it being seen as a sort of, you're being brought on now because we can, it's actually seeing what's special about those players and what can they do. So my sort of neuroscience psychology answer would be it will really depend on the player and what their prior experience has been.
I guess it also depends on the culture of the team as well, which is what you're talking about, Holly, that you know, not calling a substitution but calling them a finisher rather and a starter, and making sure that the team all recognise that they have a part to play on the pitch and off the pitch, and creating that expectation that you may get subbed and you don't get narky about it. So you might be brought on at any point and you have to be ready to support your teammates. Is all part of trying to create a culture where there isn't, you know, it's bad enough, you know, it's complicated enough, the coaching decision, but the player psychology, you know, is something you can probably more easily nail.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask, so the kind of research and data you gather, do you ever kind of collaborate with people who work with kind of the general public to kind of share the information that you get about the players' fitness and player psychology and data, to kind of help the public, you know, just people on the streets, I guess, or watching the matches, kind of make better decisions about their own fitness and health?
So, I mean, as a scientist, which is what I do, so we very much try to do that. So we very much try to get data out into the open, but we're not trying to make money out of our science generally. So I think most of it is not open. But further down the line, there will probably be scientific studies that will use the data once it's no longer relevant for the particular team. So potentially at that point.
Yeah, I think a lot of physical data is made available, you know, summary physical data is made available. Whether it educates the public or not is another question. The sort of data, again, I'm not sure if it's available in the World Cup, but in the Premier League, you'll be able to see the total distance that a player covers in 90 minutes is 8 to 12 kilometres based on, depending on position. They'll do, you know, about a kilometre of high intensity running during a game, a couple of hundred high intensity accelerations. It's kind of interesting to think about, you know, your own personal level of fitness versus what a player's doing on the pitch. But yeah, whether it's education or not, these numbers are kind of just used as colour for pundits to blame players if they haven't run about enough, or praise them if they have run about a lot, without understanding, you know, it's whether the running helped you in the game is the important thing.
Oh, sorry, you had something.
Well, I think I just say, because I do see normal people as well as players, and I think there is a trickle down, isn't there, of technology? And I think the danger really is that, you know, people, you know, want a GPS unit, or they want, you know, there's loads of wearables where you can track what you're doing and use some of those techniques. But I think going back to what we were talking about earlier, in actual fact, the most important things, if you're not an elite player, are not the sort of the 1% kind of marginal gains, because, you know, the clues in the name, they're marginal, and the big 99% gains come from the nutrition and the sleep and a sustained strength and conditioning program, some of those things which are really widely available to the general public, but they're more boring and they don't make sure it's good Christmas and birthday presents, and so they're probably taken up less avidly than they could do. But if somebody was going to do 2 or 3 months of really serious strength and conditioning training and good nutrition, good recovery, they would probably see a massive boost in their own physical performance.
Good evening, guys. Objectively, is the game better or worse for the advances in sports science, data science and neuroscience? I ask this because colloquially it feels that creativity may have been squeezed out of the game because of the changes in, say, player selection. They're chosen for athletic attributes, physical attributes. Famously, Lionel Messi underwent growth hormone therapy as a child because it was feared that he wouldn't grow to be big and strong enough to play the game. And what a criminal act that would have been for us to have lost out on 20 plus years of domination. As well as that, it feels that because of the advances in perhaps more data science, that the gap between the old footballing superpowers and emerging nations feels lesser than ever. I guess in recency bias, we've seen some results at this current World Cup and emerging trends where a lesser nation go on a real good run, upsetting the odds, so to speak. Just keen to see if there's any data to support that or not. Thank you.
In terms of the lesser nations, I think there is some evidence for that. I haven't done a proper statistical analysis of it, but compared to maybe 20 or 30 years ago, you see quite a lot of the non-European nations will use their European diaspora for a huge number of their players. So quite a few of the West African nations have got a lot of players that grew up in France or grew up elsewhere in Western Europe, where they have the Western European football education that's not available to them in their home countries. Rewind 20 years ago, where everyone was just choosing their local players. I think the other thing that's happened is just a general professionalization. So those basic things you can do with fitness and learning how to defend properly and being able to hire a professional coach that knows how to set up a minnow like Panama to defend against a team like England. 20 years ago, it would have been just, whoever the famous Panama player would be the coach of the national team. So I think there is something to be said for that. And even Portugal used 4 non-Portuguese players when I say non-Portuguese, they qualified for Portugal when they won the Euros in 2016. That was partly the result of a data exercise where my old boss, Julian Ward, who worked for the Portuguese FA, trawled through Europe looking for players with Portuguese grandparents. Regarding whether the game's better today or not, it's better today, full stop, no argument. Watch a random Premier League game from the mid-1990s and tell me that today's game's worse, and I'm going to strongly disagree with you.
Yeah, you mentioned the sort of creativity, and you asked. So I would argue that one of the issues is that there are things that are very difficult to train. So in terms of creativity, decision making, because there are limited situations where you gain experience of those, they're actually quite difficult for anyone to train. Whereas there are lots of things like physically that you can train. So I think because lots of things have been optimized and none of those really, I might be too judgmental, but none of those are really that creativity. I would argue, therefore, that actually neuroscience could help, but that's very difficult to do. So I don't think neuroscience is detrimental. It's just that everything else has been used a lot more.
There's a question down here.
Thank you very much. I guess my question is around the intangibles around football, maybe something that data can't specifically deal with, and I'm going to go there and say the refereeing is one of those things that's like, it's very difficult to set up in a way that you don't necessarily know what kind of refereeing performance you're going to get. And secondly, the other thing, and I know everyone here loves XG, but execution is as big a part of football as the skill divide between the two teams that you're observing for. So how do you kind of set up in a way that, you can have all the hydration and nutrition and conditioning, but ultimately, the best teams have similar levels of this, and games can, or to the general public, it appears games come down to these very fine margins. So how do you adjust or counter for that from data and psychological perspective? Thank you.
On XG, if your point was that kind of finishing, being able to score is still important. It doesn't matter what the XG was. Whether the ball went in the net is pretty important when it comes to the outcome of the game. Then I agree with you. It depends on what flavour of XG you want to use. So XG just measures the chance that this shot taken in this situation from this location will become a goal. If you're closer to goal, it's easier to convert a shot into a goal, is what it comes down to, basically. Now, players can and do differ in skill when it comes to their ability to place the shots accurately. And even once you've taken that into account, some players score goals more often than they should because there are things missing from the data that are still important in converting that goal. That being said, XG tells you 80%, and the finishing and the distribution of skills in goalkeeping and striker finishing is maybe 20% of that. With referees in a particular game, a particular referee in performance, you're right, it's variable and hard to predict. That being said, COVID gave us a great opportunity to see what the world was like without crowds, and a lot of refereeing bias towards the home team disappeared when COVID happened in empty stadiums. So that data showed us how biased refs were based on who's playing at home. And what you saw was the more important the decision was for the home team, the more likely the ref was to give it. So if you just look at fouls in general, there's a small home advantage. Yellow cards, it's a bit bigger. Red cards, it's really big. Fouls leading to a penalty, it's like, 2-1 or something in favour of the home team. So, data can tell you something about the general tendencies of the referee, if not what this ref's going to do in this game.
We've got time for one more quick one back there.
Thank you. So we've talked a lot about the rate of adoption of data over the last 20 years, Ian, you referenced that. We've talked about the difference between teams using it and not using it. We've talked about the intangibles and the variances that we can't control in terms of neuroscience and otherwise. If we think forward 5-10 years' time, where are we with data and football or sport in more general? Where do we think the evolution is going to come from? And do we think the gains at this point are more marginal across the board, or a levelling up of the playing field, excuse the pun, with regards to football? Or do we think there's still more to be done from a revolutionary perspective to increase the jeopardy, increase the performance, and actually perhaps more convergence between data, playing performance, and the intangibles and neuroscience mentality, and therefore contribution to the all-round perfect player?
Just an easy question to end up with there.
So in our area, we talk a lot about personalised medicine, and can you target that person's sort of whole self and work out what the best option is for them? And I guess from my point of view, looking at the sort of whole player is going to be really important, and that will be, as the generations come through, that's going to be looking at how do we integrate that sort of mental health support, can we look at how players need to interact with other people. So there's a whole bunch of things that, Charlotte alluded to, the team dynamics. Getting that right is going to be really important. So I think how you're going to get the best out of a team, obviously there'll be a lot of data, but some of that will be a lot more behavioural, I think, than it is at the moment.
Okay, we're out of time. Thank you to the Royal Society for hosting us tonight. Thanks to our wonderful panellists, Charlotte Cowie, Holly Bridge, Ian Graham. Thanks to you all for coming. Thanks to those listening. Do follow and subscribe to The World, the Universe and Us, wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll see you soon. Thanks very much.